The conflict of mind on the faulty mechanics of thought and resulting reasonableness of moderation. Part 1. If X is true, but there is no evidence verifying X, then it is irrational, intellectually irresponsible, and correct to believe X. In this situation, it is correct not to believe what is correct, and the right thing to do is to not believe what's right to believe. This assumes something can be true without evidence that it is true beyond unfalsifiable claims. Examples supporting this assumption and/or possibility: I tell you that I plowed my sleigh into a tree when I was 12. Hemingway claims he is being monitored by U.S. intelligence. I claim that you will love me one day. 1.1. If X is false, but there is evidence verifying X, it is rational and intellectually responsible and wrong to believe X. In this situation, it is wrong not to believe what is false, and the wrong thing to do is to not believe what's wrong to believe. This assumes something false can be seemingly proven. Though it may ultimately be the case that this doesn't hold, it can at least occur temporarily and/or ostensibly. Examples: the Replication Crisis. My father shows me tickets to a concert and says we're going, but knows he's lying. I dislike you, but for the sake of manipulating you, I buy you flowers, chocolates, and praise you. If X is true, but there is evidence verifying and disproving X, it cannot be said for sure if it is epistemically moral or immoral to assent to X. Over X, there can be anxiety. Do note. Point 2. If X is true and will be verified in 10 days, for 10 days it is irrational, intellectually irresponsible, and correct to believe X. If X is true but never verified, it is also irrational, intellectually irresponsible, and correct to believe X. The more rational the person, the more it is expected to be the case the person never believes the truth. Point 3. To allude to W.K. Clifford, it is not the case that a person who is epistemically moral will necessarily be more correct than someone who is epistemically immoral. In fact, it is possible for epistemic responsibility to be what drives someone into error. Consider if Hemingway tells me that he is being monitored by U.S. intelligence but cannot provide me with any hard evidence. It is reasonable for me to tell Hemingway to see a doctor and make sure he isn't suffering from hallucinations. If he claims I don't believe in him, I am justified and even epistemically obligated to tell him something Bertrand Russell said he would tell God. Why don't you have more evidence? Point 4. In line with the thought of flip moments by O.G. Rose, if X will be verified in 10 days, between now and then it is epistemically irresponsible to believe in X. In 10 days, it will suddenly be epistemically responsible to believe in X, as if it was always epistemically responsible to believe in X. To elaborate, for 10 days, there will be reason to believe those who believe in X are poor thinkers. In 10 days, there will be reason to believe those who always believed in X are good thinkers, unless, that is, it is understood that being epistemically responsible and wrong isn't to be a poor thinker, but rather to be caught in a tragedy of being thoughtful, as this paper hopes to establish. Point 5. For 10 days, in regard to unverifiable and true X, to the degree a person is epistemically responsible and moral is to the degree the person will be wrong, while to the degree a person is epistemically irresponsible and immoral is to the degree the person will be right. Being right isn't necessarily the same as being epistemically responsible, as being wrong isn't necessarily the same as being epistemically irresponsible. This point is similar to the idea that being true and being rational aren't identical, as explored in The True Isn't the Rational by O.G. Rose. Point 6. In 10 days, it will be epistemically responsible and moral to believe in X. Hence, it is possible for what is epistemically irresponsible temporarily to be epistemically responsible ultimately, and vice versa. Point 7. It is possible there are truths which will always be epistemically irresponsible and or immoral to believe, as it is possible there are falsities which will always be epistemically responsible and or moral to believe. Discerning if this was ever the case would require being God. Point 8. The ethics of rationality can conflict with truth that rationality is toward, the truth that rationality is toward. The ethics by which people know a thing can conflict with the truth of that thing. People will inevitably find themselves in the middle of this conflict, by the way. Someone will tell us about something that happened to them and there won't be evidence for it. The government will tell us things that they are unwilling to unveil, how they learn to avoid compromising their secret operatives. Peer-reviewed articles will be published that are later falsified. Government officials will propose lessening privacy in order to stop terrorist attacks which the officials claim are likely to happen but never verify. Point 9. The ethics of the mind can conflict with the rightness of the mind. Resembling the life of the mind phrase, this dilemma is what I will call the conflict of mind. The bigger and more complex the issue, by the way, the higher the likelihood there will be conflict of mind situations, suggesting an advantage of smaller systems. Point 10. Democracies that fail to prepare for and educate people about conflicts of the mind are democracies that will prove more likely to fail than those that do. Section 2. Since absolute objectivity is impossible for humans, it is meaningless to worry about whether X is wrong in a situation in which it is epistemically responsible to believe in X, isn't it? To pose a hard question. Likewise, is it similarly meaningless to worry about whether I'm wrong to believe what I'm epistemically responsible to believe, or to worry that what I've decided is epistemically irresponsible to believe is actually correct? Point 2, in line with the thought of On Worry by O.G. Rose, there is a difference between worrying about X and being aware of X. No, people should not worry that what they find epistemically responsible to believe is actually false, but they should be aware of this possibility, as they should be aware of the possibility that what is epistemically irresponsible to believe could be true. The worry about the possibility could lead to anxiety. Awareness could lead to intellectual humility. Intellectual humility is important in our pluralistic age where we live in the midst of people who think fundamentally and essentially different than we do. See Belonging Again by O.G. Rose, and this is point 3. It is likely we will encounter people who we believe are wrong and those we will likely be quick to verify as wrong. Intellectual humility can help us combat this natural tendency to ideology preserve, as discussed in The Truism of the Rational. When we encounter someone believing something that is epistemically irresponsible to believe, it might be the case the person is still right, and intellectual humility will increase the likelihood that we don't dismiss the person outright, as if the conflict of mind didn't exist. Socrates was intellectually humble. To elaborate on point 3, the more aware we are that epistemic responsibility can conflict with truth, the more we won't be quick to judge those who are currently epistemically responsible to believe X as those who will necessarily always be epistemically responsible to believe X, though such may end up being the case. Likewise, we won't be quick to judge those who are currently epistemically irresponsible to believe X as those who necessarily believe something that is false, nor will we act like we are objective, like scientists, when we turn out to be right, aware that the right isn't necessarily the epistemically responsible. The more aware we are that we can be epistemically responsible yet also wrong, as we could be epistemically irresponsible yet right, the more we will also develop valuable self-skepticism and intellectual openness to those who don't think like us being not too sure that we are right, which brings to mind a line from Judge Leonard Hand. The spirit of liberty is the spirit which is not too sure that it is right. To elaborate more, the less aware we are that epistemic responsibility can conflict with truth, the more likely we are to conflate being epistemically responsible with being right. If we conflate these two, then when we meet someone who is wrong, we will assume the person is always epistemically irresponsible, and hence we may not bother reasoning with that person. Furthermore, since no one believes what they believe thinking they are wrong, no one believes what they believe thinking it's not true, we will all necessarily and naturally think of ourselves as always epistemically responsible, protecting ourselves and our ideologies with a moral layer that will increase the likelihood we will not change our minds even when we should. The conflation of being right and being epistemically responsible can also increase the likelihood that we will think of someone who is right as necessarily committed to truth, no matter where it leads, to allude to Thomas Jefferson. Similarly, we are likely to think of someone who is wrong as necessarily not committed to truth, all while we necessarily think of ourselves as so committed. To elaborate more, as of a flip moment when X becomes true and hence epistemically responsible to believe, it will be as if those who didn't believe in X before the flip moment were always epistemically irresponsible, ideological, willfully ignorant, oblivious to the facts, and so on, even if at the time disbelief was the epistemically responsible thing to do. The converse also holds. It will be as if those who believed in X while it was epistemically irresponsible were always epistemically responsible. As of a flip moment, when X becomes false and it's epistemically irresponsible to believe, it will be as if those who believe in X before the flip moment were always epistemically irresponsible, ideological, and so on, even if it was the epistemically responsible thing to do. The converse also holds. It will be as if those who disbelieved in X while it was epistemically irresponsible were always epistemically responsible after a flip moment. Considering all this, determining epistemic responsibility can be like the problem of observational equivalence. We observe output X, but not context Y necessary for interpreting X. Excuse me. Point 4, intellectually humble, we will be more likely to keep our ears, hearts, and minds open to the other, as is needed in our diverse age. If there is a failure to realize that what constitutes epistemic responsibility is relative to what a person believes is true, the nature of the evidence for the truth, one's relative standards of justification, and the like, there will be a lack of intellectual humility, and furthermore, calls for people to be intellectually honest could very well worsen the problem. Section 3. Classically, philosophy has defined knowledge as justified true belief, or JTB. Edward Gettier famously devised hypotheticals in which I could meet the criteria of JTB and yet not have knowledge. However, I do believe that Lucas Lozansky, forgive me if that's a mispronunciation, in his article, The Gettier Problem is no longer a problem, has provided a strong argument to continually use the classical definition. Point 2, if I believe in something as knowledge that doesn't meet the criteria of JTB, I am epistemically irresponsible. In many respects, what makes knowledge epistemically responsible is precisely that it is justified true belief. If I believe it is knowledge that tomorrow afternoon I will be at the train station versus probably knowledge, when I could theoretically be in a car wreck, get sick, so on, then I act epistemically irresponsible. And yet tomorrow at the train station it will suddenly be JTB that I will be at the train station on New Year's Day 2017 at 2 p.m. as if it was always justified true belief. To elaborate, if I believe it isn't knowledge that I will be at the train station on January 1st, 2017 at 2 p.m., while at the train station at that date and time, because I think really reality might be an illusion, that I might be dreaming and so on, then I act epistemically irresponsible. And yet if at that date and time I'm not at the train station, it will be as if the premise was never JTB or knowledge. But isn't it possible that the world could be an illusion? Yes, but such a claim can't be falsified, and considering Karl Popper, believing such a claim constituted knowledge would be incorrect. It's only a possibility, which frankly means very little. For more on this argument, though, consider Bridging the Kants by O.G. Rose. Point 3, if at 12 years old I plowed my sleigh into a tree, this memory, which relative to me is a justified true belief, constitutes knowledge. It is a belief because it is something that I think happened in the world. It is justified because I still have a scar on my arm from the wreck and a vivid memory of it happening. It is true because I actually did hit the tree and have no falsifiable reason to believe I am in the matrix. Point 4, if I tell you that at 12 I plowed my sleigh into a tree, what is JTB to me isn't JTB to you. If anything, it is an unjustified, maybe true belief. And yet, if you believe me, you believe something that is true and something that is knowledge to me, and hence is knowledge. In this way, unjustified, maybe true belief can be relative knowledge and or personal knowledge. It can be a belief because you believe what I am telling you. It isn't justified because you can't know for sure that the scar I show you is actually from the wreck, though you can believe me. And furthermore, you cannot share in my memory of the wreck. And you can't know if it's true or false because you can't know if I actually did hit the tree, and there's no evidence of it happening or not beyond what I say, though again, you can't believe me. Point 5, if you believe what I am telling you is knowledge, which it actually is to me, and it doesn't meet the criteria of JTB to you, there is a sense in which you are epistemically irresponsible and yet correct. Point 6, hence, though it is only epistemically responsible to consider JTB knowledge, it isn't the case that everything which isn't JTB to me can't be knowledge to anyone, and furthermore, it isn't the case that what isn't JTB or epistemically responsible is necessarily false. Conversely, it isn't the case that what is JTB or epistemically responsible to me can necessarily be such to anyone, though it might be. To elaborate, could this problem of relativity be avoided by only defining JTB in terms of scientific evidence exclusively or the experience of no one in particular, to borrow language from The Extraordinary Kindly Inquisitors by Jonathan Rauch? This means particular persons are interchangeable. A scientific evidence can be observed as itself meaning what it means regardless who observes it. Certainly, liberal science is necessary for any functioning society, Jonathan Rauch teaches us. But liberal science will not be enough to save us from conflicts of mind. Not all truths are scientific truths, and not all evidence is scientific evidence. Furthermore, all truth is experienced through and in an I, even scientific truth, a self. So even when it comes to believing a scientific truth, I remember it and experience it like a personal memory. It resides in the same brain and flashes across my consciousness in a similar way. No, a scientific truth is not identical to a memory. Other people can observe it. It's not as easily manipulated. It can be falsified, etc. But it is like a memory and any other relative knowledge I may hold within. And all I have when I'm not in the actual presence of the scientific evidence, which is often. Hence, a scientific justified true belief is something I will usually experience like a non-scientific JTB. And on this point, it is possible that I find myself in relative situations over a scientific JTB like I can find myself over a non-scientific JTB, say when a scientific study is proven to be wrong. Furthermore, science cannot provide me with total certainty. See the short story Ludwig by O.G. Rose. And so, though necessary, liberal science alone cannot save us from conflicts of the mind, especially not in daily experiences, nor even make us feel like we're safe. To elaborate, to comment further on The Kindly Inquisitors by Rauch, which I rarely miss an opportunity to do, I would add that though liberal science may help us define belief from knowledge, it is unfortunately not the case that only it is not the case that only what is knowledge is true, and Rauch does not claim such. There are true beliefs, and though liberal science may be invaluable in helping us determine what we should do with perhaps true knowledge over and or against perhaps true beliefs, we are still faced with the problem of figuring out how to manage our perhaps true beliefs, which entails our fundamental axioms, or what James Davis Hunter calls first principles. Determining this is imperative for our pluralistic age, and I believe Hunter can help us solve this puzzling problem. His work is discussed at length in Belonging Again by O.G. Rose, as well as toward the end of this paper. Before the Shooting Begins by Hunter is particularly invaluable. Point 7. A world in which everyone assents only to JTB and is epistemically responsible isn't a world in which everyone is necessarily correct. Failure to understand this could lead people to believe problems in democracy can be solved by teaching everyone to only believe what is justified true belief, JTB, and epistemically responsible, when in fact a society full of people committed to justify true belief and epistemic responsibility will not necessarily be a society free of conflict. In fact, it could be a society more destined to be stuck in conflict precisely because it believes it knows how to be done with conflict. Just force the other to change. If you tell me that at 12 you plowed your sleigh into a tree, you tell me that which cannot be falsified, especially by me, but is nevertheless JTB relative to you. Considering this, it isn't the case that what cannot be falsified is is that which necessarily isn't a justified true belief. Section 4. In line with Ludwig by O.G. Rose, since total and or absolute certainty is impossible, since I cannot know for sure that all the scientists aren't lying to me about global warming, that the Vikings existed, that there aren't angels in the room, considering that absolute certainty is impossible, is intellectual honesty and or epistemic responsibility even possible? Point 2. To have total certainty isn't the same as being epistemically responsible. Though Karl Popper's falsification cannot give me total certainty, it can give me practical certainty or confidence. And as long as this certainty always remains open to falsification, my practical certainty becomes practically indefinable from total certainty. Hence, living according to Popper's thought is perhaps to live as epistemically responsible as is possible. Point 3. But can everything that is true be falsified? Knowing this would require knowing everything true, which only God can know. It is very possible that there exists knowledge and or JTB that cannot be falsified. This being the case, what would constitute epistemic responsibility would entail the application of the right method of truth to the right kind of truth, to apply falsification to truth that can be falsified, to apply aesthetic epistemologies to works of art, logical arguments to ethics, and so on. Hence, being epistemically responsible entails applying the right epistemologies to the right kinds of truth, to use the right mental models, in other words. To elaborate, if I apply falsification to art, I act epistemically irresponsible. But in positivistic society that practically believes that all truth can be scientifically verified, I very well might be deemed epistemically responsible. Point 4. Determining if someone is epistemically responsible about X requires knowing which epistemological method is right for knowing X. A society, hence, that isn't well-trained in epistemology is likely a society that lacks capacities necessary for discerning levels of epistemic responsibility accurately, and yet is a society no less likely to make these kinds of judgments. To elaborate, if everyone is using an aesthetic epistemology by which to judge a painting, and I am a positivist who believes that only scientific epistemology is valid for knowing truth, relative to me, the other person is objectively epistemically irresponsible. And if I conflate being epistemically irresponsible with being right, I will also think of the person as wrong. Only using a positivistic epistemology, I lack any method for knowing I am wrong, unable to see non-positivistic phenomenon as evidence. And hence I have every reason to think I am right, to think the other is epistemically irresponsible and wrong. In fact, my method for understanding reality actually makes it so that I have evidence that the other is wrong, and hence I have reason to believe I am being epistemically responsible for thinking such, and if I conflate being such with being right, I have reason to think I am also right. The conflation of being right and being epistemically responsible doesn't create a bubble, but an impenetrable fort. To elaborate, whether trained in epistemology or not, people will claim of others that they are ignorant, uninformed, willfully ignorant, and the like. Claims about the epistemic responsibility and morality of others will fill any democracy, precisely because if a person thinks X and not Y, in a society where some people do believe Y, the person must convince his or herself that he or she is justified to believe X instead of Y. Hence, the more pluralistic the society, the more likely ideology justifying preserving claims such as claims about the epistemic responsibility of others and oneself will be made. Furthermore, this also means the more pluralistic the society, the more imperative it is for people not to conflate being epistemically responsible and being right. Point 5. What constitutes epistemic responsibility is relative to the truth it is toward and the methods by which the truth can be known. If we agree that how the truth is known of a memory is different than how the truth is known of chemistry, then we agree that there isn't a single epistemology that we can use as a standard by which to determine epistemic responsibility, ergo irresponsibility, or irresponsibility. I believe this assumption is fair to make, seeing as people do have memories that really have happened to them, but real memories are different in kind from real rocks, physical and observable phenomenon that aren't bound to a single subjectivity in their conceivability. In regard to epistemology, in light of monotheism by O.G. Rose, a monotheistic society, one that ascribes to one theory of epistemology in this case, by which to explain all phenomenon versus multiple theories, is one that won't be epistemically responsible. If we say that I am only epistemically responsible for investigating claims that meet the standard of epistemological method X, liberal science, for example, then we are only epistemically responsible for investigating claims that fall under that method. On the other hand, if we say the opposite, we are epistemically responsible for much more, regardless of the complexity. This suggests the extraordinary temptation to be monotheistic, both in epistemology and generally. Point 6. Since total certainty is impossible, to define epistemic responsibility in its terms would be illogical and unrealistic. Rather, it should be defined against practical certainty in terms of the right epistemological method for the truth toward which the epistemic responsibility is directed. To elaborate, but how do we determine which epistemic method is the right one? This is the question which the field of epistemology is devoted to. It exceeds the scope of this paper by many books. That said, it should be noted at least that mastering epistemology will increase the likelihood that we align being epistemically responsible with being right, though there is no guarantee. To elaborate, if for truth X one person uses epistemic model Y and another uses epistemological method Z, by what standard can we say Y is right and not Z for X? If the study of epistemology cannot provide us with this answer, one that might arguably involve ontology, then the first person is as justified as the second, and both will be equally valid to be locked in to whatever conclusion they reach about X, regardless how wrong that conclusion might be. If epistemological methods can all be equally ascribed to conflicts of the mind, or even more likely, for there will be no standard against which people can determine if the method that they are using in which to define and be epistemically responsible is the correct and or fitting method for a given truth claim, increasing the likelihood that epistemic methodology, responsibility, and truth all come in conflict. In other words, if it cannot be determined that Thomistic logic should be used to determine an ethical claim about murder, for example, then a person's intellectual commitment to neuroscience will keep the person from determining the right thing to do about murder, a commitment the person will have no reason to move out from. Well, how do we determine at what point we achieve practical certainty about premise X? How do we know which model we should use? This leads us to questions of justification that shall be explored in section 7.